The first thing I smelled wasn't blood. It was the scorched, metallic scent of a drill hitting bone. My 6-year-old son, Leo, was screaming in the bedroom above me. Not a nightmare scream, a something is tearing me apart scream. When I reached him, his mouth was a red mask. He hadn't fallen. An invisible force had just plucked his molars straight out of his gums. That was 12 minutes ago. Now the floorboards beneath my feet are vibrating with a wet, rhythmic scraping. My lawyer is standing in the doorway, but he isn't holding legal papers. He's holding a ritual bone saw, and he's looking at my son's jaw like it's collateral for a loan. He told me I have until the sun goes down to settle the arrears, or the creditor downstairs will take the rest of Leo's skeleton. One bone at a time. I thought we were just a wealthy family with a big estate. I didn't know the Miller fortune was built on a lease, and the rent is paid in calcium. Let me take you back to the day my grandfather died, and the ledger that showed me exactly what we owe. Dust motes danced in the amber glow of the desk lamp as Ethan Miller traced the rust-colored smears across his grandfather's ledgers. The copper scent of dried blood clung to the yellowed parchment, mingling with the heavy aroma of cigar smoke embedded in the velvet curtains. He pried open the mahogany inheritance box, the hinges emitting a dry, rhythmic croak. Inside, velvet lining cradled dozens of human molars. Some remained pearly white. Others bore the jagged edges of a violent extraction. The weight of the gold coins beneath the teeth pressed against his palms like lead. Every cent in the ledger corresponded to a root, a grim tally of the Miller fortune. Ethan's thumb brushed against a particularly large molar, its surface pitted and yellowed. He counted the entries on the page, his lips moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. 12, 13, 14, asterisk. He needed the numbers to balance. But the math of the Miller legacy was written in a language of pain he was only beginning to translate. The air in the study felt thick, like he was breathing through wet wool, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lean inward, eager to hear the secrets of the dead. The heavy oak door crashed against the wainscoting. Sarah stumbled inside, her knuckles white as she gripped Leo's trembling shoulders. The boy's mouth hung open, a crimson trail leaking down his chin. "Ethan, it happened again," Sarah gasped. Her chest heaved, pulling the fabric of her silk blouse taut. He was playing with his blocks, and it ripped out. Leo's eyes darted toward the shadows in the corner. "It wasn't ready," the boy whispered, his voice whistling through the new gap in his gums. It wanted more than one. A rhythmic grinding erupted beneath the floorboards, the sound of serrated metal dragging against stone. The floorboards buckled, vibrating with a force that rattled the crystal decanters on the sideboard. Ethan gripped the edge of the desk, his fingernails digging into the polished wood. The ledger slid toward the floor, its pages flipping to a final entry written in ink so dark it appeared bruised. The debt remained unpaid. Ethan looked at his son, seeing the terror in the boy's military straight posture, and then at the floorboards that seemed to pulse like a living throat. Ethan lunged toward the boy, his mind racing through structural tolerances and load-bearing capacities, trying to find a logical explanation for the floor's upheaval. He took 4 long strides, 1, 2, 3, 4, to reach Leo, scooping him into his arms. The boy felt impossibly light, like a bird made of glass. Sarah was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together, a sound that mirrored the grinding beneath their feet. "Get him to the sofa," Ethan commanded, his voice tight. "The foundation is shifting. It's just old timber settling." Even as he said it, he knew the lie was as thin as the parchment in his ledger. The grinding sound grew louder, a wet, slurping noise joining the metallic rasp. It sounded like something enormous was trying to swallow the very air in the room. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the gap in the floorboards, where the darkness seemed more substantial than the wood surrounding it. The front door groaned on its hinges. The heavy deadbolts, installed on the outside, he remembered with a jolt of ice in his gut, sliding back with a series of heavy thuds. Lawrence Sterling stepped into the foyer, his silver hair shimmering under the chandelier. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored overcoat. Instead, he wore a heavy leather apron over a dark suit. In his right hand, he gripped a medical bag. In his left, a long, curved blade that caught the light with a cruel, surgical gleam. "The interest is compounding, Ethan," Sterling said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. He didn't offer condolences for Arthur's passing. He didn't ask about Leo's health. He simply clicked his silver pocket watch open and closed. Click, 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 the sound echoing like a guillotine. "Your grandfather understood the necessity of punctuality. The house does not appreciate delays in its dividends." Ethan stood his ground, placing himself between the attorney and his family. "Get out, Lawrence. My father is dead. The contracts are void." Sterling smiled, a thin, predatory expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The Miller contract is not with a man, Ethan. It is with the land. And the land is very, very hungry." Ethan decided to play the man's game. He reached out, his hand steady, and gestured toward the ledger. "If it's a matter of accounting, let's look at the books. I'm a developer, Lawrence. I know how to settle a balance. If there's a lien on this property, we can pay it off in cash. 10 million? 20? Just name the figure and we'll leave tonight." He felt a surge of confidence. Every problem had a price tag, and the Miller estate was worth billions. He could buy their way out of this madness. He just needed Sterling to see reason, to act like the professional he claimed to be. Sterling's smile softened, becoming almost fatherly. He stepped closer, the scent of peppermint and formaldehyde wafting off him. "I appreciate your pragmatism, Ethan. It's a trait you inherited from Arthur. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps a more modern arrangement can be reached. Let me see the boy's mouth. If the extraction was clean, we might be able to defer the next payment." Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He stepped aside, allowing Sterling to approach Leo. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her shoulders dropping. The crisis was being managed. Logic was winning. But as Sterling leaned over Leo, Ethan noticed a detail that made his blood run cold. Sterling wasn't looking at the boy's gums. He was looking at the floorboards behind Leo. The attorney's fingers weren't reaching for a medical tool. They were tracing a pattern in the air, a sequence of movements that seemed to command the shadows. Ethan turned his head. The grinding sound hadn't stopped. It had merely changed frequency, becoming a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated in his molars. The floor exploded. A limb, gray and translucent like a peeled grape, shot upward through the oak planks. It was 10 feet long, multi-jointed, and ended in a cluster of twitching, needle-thin fingers. Before Ethan could scream, the limb wrapped around his waist, the skin feeling like cold, wet leather. He was yanked off his feet, his heels dragging across the carpet as the entity pulled him toward the gaping hole in the floor. "The debt isn't in gold, Ethan," Sterling shouted over the roar of splintering wood. The attorney's face was transformed, his eyes wide and manic. "It's in the architecture of the soul. The calcium is just the currency. You thought you could buy your way out with paper? You're the collateral, you and the boy." Ethan lunged for the heavy brass lamp on the desk, his fingers clawing at the cold metal. He swung it with every ounce of his strength, the base smashing into the translucent limb with a sickening thud. A spray of clear, viscous fluid erupted from the wound, smelling of ancient sea salt and rot. The limb recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for Ethan to roll away. He grabbed Leo, throwing the boy toward Sarah. "Run!" Ethan screamed. "To the stairs!" As he scrambled to his feet, his hand brushed against Sterling's open briefcase, which had fallen in the scuffle. A single, heavy sheet of vellum fluttered out. Ethan snatched it, shoving it into his pocket without looking. He didn't need to see it to know it was the key. He backed away from the hole in the floor, his chest heaving, watching as the gray limb retreated into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of shimmering slime that began to eat into the wood like acid. They didn't make it to the stairs. The house itself seemed to groan in protest, the walls tilting at impossible angles. Ethan led them into the kitchen, the scent of copper and old bone now so thick it felt like a physical weight on his tongue. He slammed the heavy oak door, sliding the bolt home, though he knew it was a symbolic gesture at best. Sarah was huddled in the corner with Leo, the boy humming that low funeral dirge, a sound that made the hair on Ethan's neck stand up. Ethan pulled the stolen page from his pocket. It wasn't a legal document. It was a map, drawn in fine, spindly lines that looked like they had been etched with a needle. It showed the estate, but not the house he knew. It showed the underhouse, a sprawling network of tunnels and chambers that mirrored the rooms above. And in the center, beneath the very spot where they stood, was a silhouette of something vast and coiled. "Leo," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside his son. The boy's gums were now a bruised, necrotic purple, and his jaw was set in a rigid, military line. "I need you to stay strong. We're going to find a way out. It's not just me, Daddy," Leo whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The man under the floor, he says the house is his skin. We're just the bugs crawling on him." Ethan looked at the map again. The lines seemed to pulse. He realized then that the estate wasn't a property. It was a cage. And Lawrence Sterling wasn't just a lawyer. He was the zookeeper, ensuring the beast below was fed enough to keep the Miller fortune growing. He looked at the heavy dumbwaiter in the corner of the kitchen, its wooden doors scarred and pitted. According to the map, that shaft led straight into the heart of the underhouse. The silence that followed was worse than the grinding. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. Ethan moved to the window, hoping to see the lights of a neighbor's house, or even the headlights of a passing car. But the world outside was gone. A thick, gray fog had swallowed the driveway, the trees, and the gates. It wasn't weather. It was a wall. He turned back to the kitchen, his mind counting the tiles on the floor. 24, 26, 28, trying to maintain his grip on reality. Sarah was watching him, her eyes wide and glassy. She reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling with a small notebook. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I brought him here. I'm sorry I didn't listen when you said we should sell. I'm sorry." "Stop apologizing, Sarah," Ethan snapped, then immediately softened his voice. "It's not your fault. It's the ledger. It's always been the ledger." He walked over to her and took her hand. Her skin was ice cold. He felt the weight of his grandfather's ring on his own finger, a band of heavy gold that now felt like a shackle. He had spent his life trying to build something clean, trying to renovate the Miller name into something respectable. But you couldn't fix a house when the foundation was built on a debt that never closed. Suddenly, the kitchen lights flickered and died. The only illumination came from the moonlight struggling through the fog, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum. The humming from Leo grew louder. a 40 hertz vibration that Ethan could feel in his marrow. "They're coming," Leo said. Ethan grabbed a heavy butcher's knife from the block, the cold steel a small comfort. He heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Not the heavy, hurried steps of Sterling, but something lighter, more rhythmic. Step, click, step, click. Asterisk. The door didn't burst open. It was pushed slowly, the hinges screaming. 2 men stepped into the kitchen. They weren't ghosts or monsters. They were men in dark, nondescript tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadows. But it was what they held that made Ethan's heart freeze. Each man carried a spool of thin, shimmering wire, dental wire, polished to a mirror finish. "Mr. Miller," one of the men said, his voice a flat, Midwestern monotone. "Mr. Sterling would like his map back, and he'd like the boy. Let's not make this a messy extraction." The man stepped forward, the wire singing as he pulled it taut between his hands. The sound was a high, sharp note that seemed to slice through the air itself. Ethan backed up, his heels hitting the base of the dumbwaiter. He had no choice. He had to go down. Ethan's mind raced, calculating the distance between him and the first enforcer. The man, Michael Reed, though Ethan didn't know his name yet, moved with a mechanical precision that suggested he'd done this 100 times. He cracked his knuckles in a 1-2-3 rhythm, the sound like dry twigs snapping. Ethan felt a surge of cold fury. These weren't supernatural entities. They were employees. They were the maintenance crew for the Miller curse. "Stay back," Ethan warned, raising the butcher's knife. Reed didn't blink. He lunged, the wire whistling toward Ethan's throat. Ethan ducked, the silver line slicing through a wooden cabinet door as if it were butter. The wood didn't just splinter, it seemed to bleed a dark, sappy fluid. Ethan kicked out, his boot catching Reed in the chest, but the man didn't even grunt. He just reset his stance, the wire singing again. "Sarah, the dumbwaiter, get Leo inside," Ethan yelled. Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled toward the small wooden door, shoving Leo into the cramped, dark space. The boy didn't cry. He just curled into a ball, his military straight posture finally breaking. Sarah climbed in after him, her apologies muffled by the velvet-lined interior. Ethan turned back to the enforcers. The second man was moving around the kitchen island, cutting off his escape. Ethan looked up at the heavy counterweight of the dumbwaiter, a massive block of iron suspended by frayed hemp ropes. He saw the release lever, a rusted iron bar near the floor. "You want the map?" Ethan shouted, pulling the vellum from his pocket. "Come and get it." He threw the paper toward the center of the kitchen. Both men instinctively lunged for it. In that split second, Ethan dropped to his knees and slammed his fist against the release lever. The sound was like a cannon blast. The iron counterweight plummeted, the rope shrieking through the pulleys. The dumbwaiter car, with Sarah and Leo inside, shot upward toward the nursery, while the secondary weight crashed down onto the kitchen island. The impact was catastrophic. The marble island shattered, sending shards of stone flying like shrapnel. The second enforcer was pinned beneath the iron block, his legs crushed instantly. He let out a wet, gurgling scream that was cut short as the floor beneath him buckled, the house skin eager to claim the fresh meat. Reed hesitated, looking at his fallen partner. Ethan didn't give him a second chance. He lunged forward, the butcher's knife leading the way. But Reed was faster. He swung the wire in a wide arc, catching the knife and snapping the blade clean off the handle. Ethan was left holding a useless piece of wood. He didn't stop. He tackled Reed, the two of them crashing through the swinging doors into the dining room. They rolled across the Persian rug, the scent of old dust and expensive wax filling Ethan's lungs. Reed's fingers were like iron claws, reaching for Ethan's throat. The wire was lost in the struggle, but the man didn't need it. He was a professional, a fixer, a man who treated murder like a data entry job. Ethan managed to get a hand free, his fingers searching for anything to use as a weapon. He felt the cold, hard edge of a silver candlestick. He swung it blindly, the heavy base connecting with Reed's temple. The man slumped, his grip loosening. Ethan didn't wait to see if he was dead. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get to the nursery. He had to get to Leo. He ran for the stairs, his feet pounding against the carpet. 2, 4, 6, 8. He reached the landing, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air up here was colder, smelling of ozone and wet earth. He could hear Sarah's voice from the nursery, a frantic, rhythmic whispering. He burst into the room. The nursery was a scene from a nightmare. The soft pastel wallpaper was peeling away in long, fleshy strips, revealing the gray, pulsing skin beneath. The crib was overturned, and the stuffed animals, the ones with the missing eyes, seemed to be watching the center of the room. The floorboards in the middle of the nursery were gone. In their place was a gaping maw of darkness. And from that darkness, dozens of translucent filaments were rising, wrapping around Leo's legs. Sarah was on her knees, her arms wrapped around the boy's waist, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "It's pulling!" she shrieked. "Ethan, it's pulling him down!" Ethan lunged for his son, grabbing the boy's shoulders. The force from below was incredible, a steady, rhythmic tug that felt like the earth itself was trying to inhale the boy. The house groaned, the walls buckling as the entity below exerted its strength. "I've got you, Leo. I've got you!" Ethan roared, his muscles screaming under the strain. But the filaments weren't just pulling, they were vibrating. Ethan could feel it in his own jaw, a sympathetic resonance that made his teeth ache. He looked down and saw the truth. The filaments weren't just wrapping around Leo. They were sinking into his skin, seeking the bone. "The buyout," Ethan whispered, his mind flashing back to the map in the hidden ledger pages. There has to be a buyout. He let go of Leo for a second, reaching into his pocket for the stolen map. He smoothed it out on the floor, his eyes scanning the spindly lines. There, in the corner, written in a hand that looked like his grandfather's, was a series of coordinates and a single phrase. "The root of the debt is in the foundation. A permanent settlement requires a total liquidation." "I have to go down," Ethan said, looking at Sarah. "I have to go to the cellar." "No," Sarah cried. "Don't leave us." "If I stay, we all die," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "Keep holding him, Sarah. Don't let go. No matter what you hear, don't let go." He kissed her forehead, the scent of her fear sweat sharp in his nostrils. Then he turned and ran. He didn't use the stairs this time. He went back to the kitchen, to the hole where the dumbwaiter had been. He grabbed the frayed rope and swung himself into the dark shaft. The descent was a blur of rough wood and cold air. He landed in the cellar, the impact jarring his spine. The floor here was dirt, thick with a century of dust and something else, something that crunched under his boots. He clicked on his tactical flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive gloom. Piles of bones, thousands of them. Not just teeth, but ribs, femurs, and skulls, all arranged in neat, geometric patterns that mirrored the rooms above. This was the Miller fortune. This was the clean wealth he had been so proud of. "Ethan," a voice called out from the shadows. Lawrence Sterling stepped into the light. The attorney looked haggard, his silver hair disheveled, but he still held the curved ritual blade. He was standing in front of a massive, pulsing mound of gray flesh that seemed to be fused with the very foundation of the house. "You're too late," Sterling said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. The interest has exceeded the boy's capacity. The silent partner is tired of installments. It wants the principal. "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, shielding his eyes from the stench of the mound. "The Miller business empire." Sterling laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "Every skyscraper you built, every mall, every luxury condo. It wasn't built on land, Ethan. It was built on the growth of the partner. And as your assets grew, so did its hunger. A few teeth were enough for your grandfather. But for a billionaire, it wants the whole skeleton. It wants the marrow." Ethan gripped the handle of a heavy sledgehammer he'd found leaning against a support beam. "I'm not letting you take him." "It's not my choice," Sterling screamed, lunging forward with the blade. The struggle was brutal and clumsy. They rolled through the piles of bones, the dust rising in choking clouds. Sterling was surprisingly strong, driven by a desperate need to survive. He slashed at Ethan's face, the blade whistling past his ear. Ethan swung the sledgehammer, the heavy head catching Sterling in the ribs with a sickening crack. The attorney gasped, dropping the blade. Ethan didn't stop. He pinned the man to the ground, his forearm across Sterling's throat. "How do I stop it?" Ethan hissed. "The buyout clause. Tell me." Sterling choked out a laugh, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "The buyout is a life for a life, Ethan. But not just any life. It has to be a Miller. And it has to be high value." Suddenly, the cellar walls began to buckle. The rhythmic pulsing from the mound grew faster, more violent. Above them, Ethan heard a sound that broke his heart. The sound of the nursery floor finally giving way. "Leo!" he screamed. A massive section of the ceiling collapsed, showering the cellar with debris and rotted timber. And there, falling through the dust, was Leo. The boy landed on a pile of bones, his small body limp. The translucent filaments were already swarming over him, pulling him toward the pulsing mound of flesh. Ethan scrambled toward his son, but a second cave-in cut him off. A wall of stone and dirt crashed down, trapping him in a small, dark pocket of the cellar. He was buried up to his waist, his legs pinned. "No," he roared, clawing at the dirt. Through a small gap in the rocks, he could see the mound opening. It wasn't a mouth, but a series of wet, clicking mandibles, each one the size of a scythe. It was moving toward Leo, its intent clear. "Ethan?" Sterling's voice came from the darkness, sounding distant and hollow. "You thought you were the developer, but you were just the architect of your own ruin. The debt is in your DNA. You can't kill it. You can only pay it." Ethan felt a cold, hard clarity wash over him. He looked at his hands, then at the sledgehammer lying just out of reach. He looked at the gap in the rocks, where his son was about to be consumed by the very legacy that had made them rich. He didn't pray. He didn't beg. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of antique dental pliers he'd snatched from the inheritance box earlier. "You want high value?" Ethan whispered, his voice sounding like grinding stone. "I'll give you the interest on 40 years of Miller greed." He decided to perform the extraction himself. It was the only logical move. As a developer, he knew that sometimes you had to tear down the most expensive part of the building to save the foundation. He was the CEO of the Miller line, the primary asset. His teeth, his bone, his marrow. They were worth more than 100 of Leo's milk teeth. He would offer the entity a settlement it couldn't refuse. He felt a strange, cold peace. This was the balance. This was the ledger closing. He opened the pliers, the cold steel clicking. 1, 2, 3. He felt the weight of his own jaw, the solid adult bone. He would start with the molars, then the incisors, then, if necessary, the jawbone itself. He could see the entity pausing, its mandibles twitching as it sensed the shift in the currency. It was interested. The deal was on the table. He placed the pliers against his back molar. He gripped the handles, his knuckles white. He could feel Sarah's presence above him, her apologies finally falling silent. He could see Leo, still and pale, a loan that was about to be called in. "For the boy," Ethan whispered. He pulled. The pain was a white-hot explosion that erased the world. It wasn't just physical. It was a structural failure of his entire being. He felt the roots snap, the sound echoing in his skull like a gunshot. Blood filled his mouth, hot and metallic. He didn't stop. He moved to the next one. Click, snap, pull. He was a machine now, a biological wrecking crew. He shoved the bloody, jagged trophies through the gap in the rocks, tossing them toward the mound. The entity hissed, its filaments darting forward to snatch the high-value offerings. Ethan's world began to tilt. The scent of his own blood was overwhelming, a thick, coppery fog. But he saw the mound retreating. He saw the filaments release Leo, drawn away by the concentrated essence of a Miller patriarch in his prime. He reached for his own jaw, the pliers slick with gore. He felt the hinge of the bone. He knew what he had to do. He had to give it the principle. He gripped the bone and twisted. The house shrieked. It wasn't the sound of wind or settling timber. It was a high, thin wail of satisfaction. The walls stopped buckling. The grinding ceased. The house skin began to harden, turning back into ordinary wood and plaster. Ethan fell back into the dirt, his face a ruined mask of red. He watched, his vision fading, as the mound sank back into the earth, taking his settlement with it. The silence that followed was absolute. Hours later, or perhaps it was days, the gray light of a Connecticut morning began to filter through the ruins of the cellar. Ethan felt a small, warm hand on his shoulder. "Daddy?" He opened his eyes. Leo was standing over him, his skin no longer translucent, his gums a healthy pink. Sarah was there too, her face tear-streaked but calm. She was holding a damp cloth to Ethan's face, her touch infinitely gentle. "It's over," she whispered. "The house. It feels like a house again." Ethan tried to speak, but his jaw was a jagged, frozen landscape of scar tissue. He managed a small, painful nod. He looked around the cellar. The bones were gone, buried deep beneath the earth. The mound was a memory. He looked at the ledger, which lay in the dirt beside him, its pages charred and blood-soaked. He realized then that he would never be even-step Ethan again. He would always walk with a limp, and his face would always be a reminder of the price of the American dream. He sat up, his movements slow and mechanical. He took Leo's hand, the boy's pulse steady and strong. "We're leaving," Sarah said. "We'll burn it down. We'll start over." Ethan shook his head. He looked at the ledger, then at his son. He knew the truth now. You couldn't burn a debt. You couldn't run from a legacy. He reached out and touched the boy's jaw, his fingers tracing the line where the bone would one day grow strong and heavy. He would teach Leo the math. He would teach him the architecture of the soul. He would ensure that when the silent partner eventually returned, and it would return, the boy would be ready to negotiate. They walked out of the ruins, 3 broken figures under a gray sky. Behind them, the Miller estate stood silent, its windows dark, its secrets buried. But as Ethan took his first step onto the gravel driveway, he didn't count, he didn't whisper. He just breathed the cold, clean air, knowing that for now, the ledger was balanced. The rent was paid, the family was safe, and the house was waiting.